Welcome to Let's Be Perfectly Queer, a queer podcast creating space to talk about all things queer. Today we're joined by Professor Paula Gerber, one of Australia's leading human rights scholars and a passionate advocate for LGBTQIA+ rights.
Questions of how you identify, seeking answers to clarify. Whether you're queen
or somewhere in between, let's be perfectly queer.
I'm just jumping in here real quick to let you know that this episode briefly mentions sexual assault, so if you need to skip this episode, please do so, and please take care while listening. Welcome to the show, Paula. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for getting in touch and wanting to jump on board, and everything that you're doing is really exciting. Before we get into it though, did you want to tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm a human rights law professor at Monash University. Before becoming an academic, I worked as a construction lawyer for many years, which is a very male-dominated, one could say toxic masculine workplace. And being a lesbian in that environment was not the greatest. And I decided, sort of had an early midlife crisis, that I would get out of private practice and find something that interested in me more and felt more satisfying and rewarding. So I stumbled upon human rights law and did a master's and then a PhD in it. And now I get to research and write and teach about human rights law and specifically the rights of LGBTQIA+ people.
That's amazing. That's a big jump from those two different sides.
It was a huge shift and one I've never for 1 second regretted making.
That's amazing. That's definitely amazing. So you have a book and it's called Sex, Gender and Identity, Trans Rights in Australia. And it's really a call to action, if I'm correct. When you say turning the tide on a climate of hatred, what does that look like in everyday life?
Well, I think at the moment the trans community in Australia is very scared, and I think with good reason, in that what we're seeing happening in other countries, particularly the US and the UK, is frightening because there really is a concerted attack on the trans and non-binary community, and particularly trans women. And the trans community in Australia is concerned that that sort of toxic transphobia is going to make its way to Australia. And so this book is really about what's going on here at the moment, what are the protections that members of the trans community have here, and are they enough to safeguard them against the winding back of their human rights that we're seeing happening in other countries.
Because we'd be silly to say that it's not going to happen here watching the rest of the world, and we kind of have to be on guard. Am I correct, to make sure that those kind of things don't happen here?
We have to be on the front foot, that's for sure. But our attitudes here, our societal attitudes and our laws are very different. So if we look at what happened in the UK with the For Women Scotland decision of the Supreme Court earlier this year, where they said under their Equality Act, women means only women who are born and designated female on their birth certificate. Now, that was under the Equality Act, which is very outdated legislation that no longer is fit for purpose. Compare that to the Sex Discrimination Act that we've got in Australia, and no court could reach the same decision. So that's what I mean, that I don't think it is, we shouldn't take it for granted that it's going to happen here, because I think our laws are much better than in the UK.
So we're pretty lucky being in Australia.
We certainly are. I mean, in terms of, I'm an ally rather than a member of the trans community. I'm certainly a member of the LGBTIQ community, but there's no place really that I'd rather be and feel safe than in Australia.
Doing this podcast, I definitely seeing what's happening around the world and listening to other people's stories. I do feel very lucky to be born in Australia and be living here and having such great protections.
Yes, but it shouldn't come down to luck about where you're born. I mean, human rights are universal. Every person in every country should be able to enjoy them. So that's why I've spent, the last 20 years advocating for greater protections of the rights of LGBTIQ people around the world, because it is just dumb luck that we were born in Australia.
Yeah, it's very true. It should be a basic human rights, and you see it everywhere, and it's a basic human right of just being able to live and go to the bathroom is being taken away, which is absolutely ridiculous.
Yes, exactly.
And talking about that, so the media loves a headline, right? They love a clickbait. They love people to just jump on board, and they definitely love a headline about trans people, especially in sports, bathrooms, prisons, schools. But what other stories and voices we don't hear that you wanted to highlight in your book or wanted to highlight in our conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're dead right. The media just want the sensational, salacious headline and story. And they ignore all the positive stories about trans people. So the book starts with the wedding that I went to of two trans women. And it was an absolutely joyous celebration of love and of them committing to spending their life together. And we need more positive stories out there rather than the fear mongering and the really vilifying of trans people. And the problem is that most people these days, most Australians, know someone who's lesbian or gay or bi. And that sort of proximity, knowing someone that is sexual orientation that's different to yours, makes it harder to hate the gays or the lesbians or the bis. But the trans community is only 0.9% of the population, so not even 1% of the population, which means that most people don't know someone who's trans. And therefore, it's easier to believe all the hate and the scary stuff that you're reading about that, trans women are wanting to get into bathrooms to rape cisgender women, which, completely ignores the fact that vast majority of rapists are white, heterosexual, cisgender men. They're not trans women. And because people don't know someone who's trans, the media actually has a real responsibility to educate and raise awareness about who trans people are, rather than just perpetuating these, as you say, clickbait headlines that scare people.
Yeah, and you mentioned trans people make up such a small percentage of the population, but somehow they make up a lot of news article headlines and have become a massive target. Why do you think that is?
I think we are all socialized and raised with very strict gender binaries. You're either a boy and you like trucks and action figures, or you're a girl and you play with dolls and tea sets. And when people cross that gender binary, other people seem to find it destabilizing. And I think it's certainly a bit of a generational thing. Younger people do not seem to have the same issues that older people have. And by older, I mean sort of people over 30, it seems. So I think we really need to raise awareness and educate people so that they realize that trans people are different, but they're not scary. And they're just being their authentic selves. And we need to be allies that are out there. When trans people are such a small percentage of the population, they can't fight this wave of transphobia on their own. They need allies who are out there standing by them, supporting them, and calling out transphobic behaviour and hate, so that we don't have people, mindlessly following someone like Trump and believing all the lies he puts out there about trans people.
Yeah, it's almost like hate and lies kind of brings communities together who are filled with hate. That's what bonds them for some reason.
Yes, although I think this is where Australia and the US are quite different. I think in times of trouble, Australians seem to pull together a bit more. In times of trouble in the US, they tend to become polarized and quite divided. So I think, I know because I've seen the research, the polls that have been done that show that Australians overwhelmingly, more than 90%, in a recent survey this year, said trans people should just be able to live their lives authentically and they've got a right to be happy and be who they are. I suspect if the same poll was done in the US, it would be a very different result. And we've also seen politicians here like Mark Latham and Catherine Deves, a political candidate, really try and use trans people as political fodder. And the Australian public said absolutely not. And a different survey said more than 80, I think it was 86 or 87% said, we do not want to see trans people used as political footballers. That's not okay. So there's not an appetite for them to be used as an issue to rally people around, like Clive Palmer tried in the last election. And one of the reasons that I think Australia is not going to go down the same path as the US is our election result this year. Peter Dutton tried his best to copy the Trump playbook and to divide Australians. And Australians said, no, thank you. And, Albanese got the greatest victory that Labor's ever had. And, his acceptance speech, he's like, we're going to be kind to each other. And I think that that is more the Australian way than what we're seeing in the US and the UK.
Yeah, I was definitely going to bring up Dutton and the fact that him doing that absolutely killed his campaign and he lost his seat because Australians were like, no, we actually support one another. And I think that's really great because sometimes seeing all the negative news, from the UK and the US, I do get scared sometimes to be a little bit more myself and to have a podcast. But then when you actually know Australia are definitely not like the US and the UK, and as well as, I think there was also a survey this year that said, I think it was like 76 or 86% of Australians still believed in same-sex marriage and that it should be around. So I think here in Australia, a bit more like, hey, we help everyone out. It really doesn't matter who you are.
Yes. And there's more important things to focus on, the cost of living, shortage of housing, wars that are going on around the world. We don't need to, beat up these silly issues and try and turn them into a moral panic when really it's the vast majority of people are just not interested in getting involved in whipping up hatred against a minority.
And it's great that, that we do have this here. And through your book, you're able to send the message out to more communities and to allies and to help them realize that we're just wanting to live and just let us live.
Yes. And I think, the audience for the book is predominantly allies. And that's not just cisgender heterosexual people. I've been really saddened to see that some members of the LGBTIQ community who've won hard-fought rights to have their sexual orientation recognised and respected and protected in law are actually turning on trans people. And I think, we've got bigger battles to fight and we're stronger together and we need to be united as one rainbow community rather than seeing, some parts going, now using LGB without the T. I just think we need to stamp that out really quickly.
I think that's what hurts the most when you see the other members of the LGBTQ plus community have turned against trans people. And you do a lot of work across the Asia Pacific through Kaleidoscope. Did you want to tell us a little bit about Kaleidoscope before I go on and ask you a question about that?
Sure. So Kaleidoscope Human Rights Foundation is an organisation that is about amplifying the voices of LGBTIQ activists in the Asia Pacific region. Because one of the things that I've noticed in Australia within the LGBTIQ community is that we tend to look inwards a lot. And that was particularly apparent during the marriage equality debate. And yet, right on our doorstep, there are 7 Pacific countries where it's still a crime to be gay. So you can be arrested and imprisoned for engaging in consensual same-sex sexual conduct in Papua New Guinea, in the Solomon Islands, in Samoa, in Tonga. And I think, we really need to be looking into our region, and similar in Asia as well, Malaysia and parts of Indonesia and Brunei. So it's really important, I think, that we've got the resources and the skills and the voice that we can amplify the advocacy of LGBTIQ people in the Asia Pacific region and help them achieve the same degree of respect for human rights that we have in Australia.
I think you kind of answered my second question there, but I was going to say, compared to our neighbours, how is Australia doing on protecting trans and gender diverse people?
So we're actually not better necessarily in the trans space. So a lot of the measures that are used relate to the criminalisation of homosexuality, but in fact, in many of these countries, trans people are well respected and valued and important members of the community. So the Whakawhinas in Samoa, the Whakalates in Tonga, they are sort of, have dinner with the royal family in Tonga, and they're very well respected. They don't use the Western language of trans, and if you do use that language, it can upset people because they're a very Christian country, but they're also very family-oriented. And there's been some attempts by churches, sort of Pentecostal churches that are trying to spread their word around the world. They've tried to get members of the churches to turn their back on trans people, and the family members are just like, no, we're not going to do that. So the law may not be better in these countries, but societal attitudes seem to be more accepting.
I've seen those stories about the Whakawhina and that kind of stuff, and it's really beautiful how they're kind of protected.
Yes. And Here it is the trans women that seem to be more of a target rather than the trans men, whereas in the Pacific nations, it's a bit the reverse. What we would call trans women tend to be more accepted and respected and revered even, and it's the trans men that can be have more difficulties being accepted for their gender identity.
That's interesting. You don't really see that anywhere else.
No, no, that's right. And it's an interesting example of, law's not necessarily the answer. I mean, I'm a human rights law professor. I obviously think laws are important, but you don't necessarily need to have the laws in place for people's rights to be respected, because we've got all the laws here and people can change their birth certificates and can bring actions in the courts if they're being discriminated against. They don't have those protective laws in Samoa and Solomon Islands and the like, but the trans community aren't necessarily saying we need that law reform.
Yeah. You've also said that a motorbike accident kind of sent you down this human rights path. I was so interested to read that. Can you tell us a bit about how that moment shifted everything for you?
Yes, I'd become a partner in a law firm, which is something I'd aspired to do since the time I was in law school, and I was working on a weekend, and when I went into the office on Saturday morning, it was, sunny and lovely, and by the time I went to go home, it was rainy and dark, and my motorbike wheel slipped on a tram track in Melbourne, and I came off my bike and ended up in hospital. And I thought I could have died for the sake of helping, this massive construction company claim millions of dollars from another massive company. And I thought, what am I doing? This is not how I want to be spending my life. I want to be doing something meaningful. And I looked at, will I teach English as a second language overseas? Will I, do a completely different career? And then one of my friends said to me, you still love the law. You just don't like being a construction lawyer. So why don't you find another area of law that you do feel is important? And so I decided that was a good idea, and I enrolled in a master's degree, and the very first subject I did was human rights. And I thought, okay, this is important. This is where I can make a difference. And, that was more than 20 years ago. And I have really seen how having a voice and being an advocate for human rights can see things change. I was part of the campaign that sought to expunge convictions for men who had been charged or convicted of offences back in the days when it was a crime to be gay. I've obviously seen marriage equality. I've seen banning of conversion practices, the removal of religious exemptions in equal opportunity and human rights laws in some states. So we're making progress. It's not as fast as I would like, but it's been a very rewarding career change because I have seen the advances that we're making in human rights protections for LGBTIQA plus people.
Yeah, sounds like you've definitely done a lot. And I think it was recently that with Tasmania and the gay men being convicted, they're getting some revenue. I can't say that word.
Yeah.
They're getting
some compensation. Yeah, reparations.
That's it.
Yes. Tasmania was the last state in Australia to decriminalise homosexuality. They did that in 1997, kicking and screaming after Nick Toonan and Rodney Croome took a complaint to the UN. And yet now they are one of the most advanced in terms of human rights protections for LGBTIQA plus people. And the government is passing legislation that is going to pay a fixed sum to men who were convicted or charged under these laws. So if you were charged but not convicted, 15,000. If you're convicted but no penalty imposed, a sentence imposed, then it will be, I think, 45,000. And if you actually were penalised through, for example, a jail sentence, then $75,000. So there's not a large group of men in Tasmania who are still alive who will be able to access that compensation, but it's a really important precedent for the rest of Australia. And I would expect to see lobbying happening soon in Victoria, in New South Wales, etc., in the ACT for a similar recognition that these laws were wrong. Now, Dan Andrews, the Premier of Victoria, has made a very powerful moving apology, this is years ago now, to gay people to say these laws were wrong then and they're wrong now and we should have never enacted them. But to really put some substance behind that apology and to pay some reparations for that wrong, I think would be a great step forward.
Yeah, 100%. And hopefully that does happen. And it is a step forward, and it does show that we can learn from our history and mistakes. And I think it's, even though there aren't a lot of the gay men around anymore, that it is definitely a signal for other states to do the right thing.
Yes. And I think also it gives me some comfort to see that we can recognise that there have been wrongs in the past and, take steps to try and remedy those. And I think about that when I see what's going on against trans people in the US and the UK. And I think, how long will it take before a future president is apologising for all the wrongs that Trump perpetrated against the trans community? I hope we don't have to wait too long for that.
Hopefully, time will tell. But with everything going on, what actually gives you hope right now?
What gives me hope is that I'm seeing the courts really making very firm decisions against discrimination against trans people. So there's a couple of cases that have wound their way through the courts recently. One is the Lesbian Action Group against the Australian Human Rights Commission, where the tribunal that heard that case said to the Lesbian Action Group, you want to hold events for lesbians, that's all well and good, but you can't say it's only for some lesbians, i.e. only for cisgender lesbians. And they came down very firmly and said, we have the Sex Discrimination Act, and that is to protect women, and that's all women. So the analogy I like to use is you can have these measures that discriminate against some people lawfully, but it's got to be in keeping with the purpose of the legislation. So if you recognise that Muslim women are not learning how to swim because they don't want to go into a swimming pool with men who are not their husbands, then it is okay for a public swimming pool to say, we're going to have a time, a couple of hours on a Sunday afternoon, which the pool is open only to women. But you can't say it's only open to lesbian women, or it's only open to women who aren't breastfeeding, or it's only open to women who aren't trans. So it's the Sex Discrimination Act, I say, is a shield rather than a sword. You can use it to protect your own rights, but not to attack somebody else's rights, which is what the Lesbian Action Group was trying to do. We've also seen the case of Tickle and Giggle, which was in the federal court, where the Giggle for Girls app was promoted as an online space for women only. Roxanne Tickle applied to join. AI reviewed a selfie that she uploaded and said, yes, you're a woman, and let her in. And 7 months later, the CEO of the company looked at that same photo and said, no, that's not a woman, and kicked Roxanne off the app. Attempts to conciliate or resolve it through negotiations didn't work. So it ended up in the federal court. The federal court came down very clearly and said, you have discriminated against Roxanne Tickle by having a women's only app, but not allowing trans women to be part of that. It's now been appealed, and we're awaiting the decision of the full court of the federal court. I'm quietly confident that the lower court decision will be upheld. I think it's very clear-cut discrimination. So that gives me hope, is seeing what the courts are doing, how they're interpreting our laws. And what also gives me hope is just seeing the results of polls about people's attitudes to trans rights here. And I think there's always more we can do, but we're starting from a good solid base in terms of people not wanting to discriminate against trans people. I think what we need to do now is to increase and educate people about trans people and their rights, because I hear and see all the time people who confuse sex and gender and sexual orientation and gender identity. And if you're a straight cisgender person, you perhaps just haven't turned your mind to these things. And so a bit more education and awareness would be a great thing to see.
Yeah, and we are starting to see that a little bit more. And hopefully there are allies who are listening who will, after listening to our conversation, go and educate themselves a bit more. And so that way they can be an informed ally and help the LGBTQ plus community as well.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's what my book is all about, is just trying to empower people and give them the confidence to speak up and speak out about trans rights and about equality, and how in Australia everyone is is equal and entitled to a fair go.
And for allies listening, if they wanted to do just one simple thing, if you had one simple thing today to support trans and gender diverse people and the LGBTQ plus community, what would you suggest?
I would say be inclusive. Really think about making sure that you are not subconsciously discriminating against people. So I will always say when I meet someone new, my pronouns are she, hers, what are yours? Little things like that, having your pronouns on your email footer, on your Zoom name description, just send a message that you are supportive, and that speaks volumes. And we need more people who are willing to just step up and say, yep, I stand with trans people.
Yeah. And before we finish this episode, did you want to let our listeners know anything else about yourself, your book?
Probably just that they can get a copy of the book at any good bookstore or at the Monash University Publishing website, and it's also available electronically through, Amazon or any of those other places where you get your ebooks. But it's a very short book. It's the shortest one I've ever written, and it's very accessible for an audience who's not necessarily very knowledgeable about either the law or trans rights. So, and maybe think about sharing it with someone else, even if you feel like you know it all. I'm seeing lots of people who are giving it to their parents or their friends as here's an opportunity for you to have a good read and upskill a bit.
Yeah, amazing. And we'll put all the links to that in our show notes, and we'll put links to your socials and that kind of stuff as well, so people know where to find you.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks for the great work that you're doing to advocate for queer rights. We need your voices for sure.
Thank you. Well, the list that you've done, I'm like, I am not worthy. You've done an incredible job in Australia for LGBTQ plus rights. So thank you so much.
Oh, thanks so much. Great talking with you.
Thanks again, Paula. It's been a wonderful, wonderful time here chatting with you. I've learnt a lot, and even just having this quick conversation, I've learnt a lot. So those listening, definitely get onto the book and you'll learn a lot more as well. So thanks again. Thanks for your time. And until next time, I hope that we have been
perfectly queer.
Let's be perfectly queer.